Language processing certainly requires working memory capacities because, I mean, at least when you think, for example, about German, I mean, where the verb, or Japanese, where the verb only, in a subordinate clause comes at the end of the sentence. So what you have to keep in memory as you go along when listening to a sentence, you have to keep in memory, for example, all the nouns, all the adjectives, everything that comes along before you then hear the verb. And the verb only allows you then to make sort of a final interpretation of the sentence. So working memory is at issue, and we know that children with low working memory capacities have problems in processing complex sentences. But the question is, can that be disentangled? Are these two different sort of capacities in the brain? So we have done an experiment where we have tried to vary the different factors, that is working memory aspects and syntactic complexity independently. Sentences were either hierarchically structured or had a flat structure, requiring sort of, for the flat structure, less syntactic processes, or we had long and short sentences where we could vary the aspect of working memory. And what we could show is the following. Syntactic aspects would activate BA44 as part of Broca's area, and working memory would activate a region right next to it that is in the inferior frontal sulcus, but independent. However, when running a functional connectivity analysis that allows us to see, do these two areas work together and how, we found that indeed for the processing of complex long sentences you need both aspects to interplay before you can interpret the sentence correctly. Working memory is not working memory. I mean, you have different aspects of working memory, as we know, visual and auditory, but even in the auditory domain, what we like to differentiate is simple phonological working memory and syntax related working memory. So phonological working memory rather involves sort of the temporal and parietal areas in the brain, and the syntax related working memory involves the frontal cortex. So different aspects of working memory are processed in different brain structures. Different languages are processed by the same brain areas, although in the detail the temporal aspects of how they integrate different types of information and also what type of information is there that they can use online to make certain assignments is different. Let's take the following example. In German, the verb in the subordinate clause is at the very end of the clause. So usually you have to go through the entire sentence before you can make your thematic role assignment, and the verb tells you sort of what the meaning of the entire sentence is. However, languages like German and Japanese, for example, they have case marking information. That is, case information is attached to the particular noun phrase. And this case information has a high reliability with respect to what particular thematic role this noun phrase could take. For example, when you have a noun phrase that is marked for nominative, it's highly likely that this element would be the subject of the sentence. And so it also is clear that the objects, you have two, the direct and the indirect object, that sort of the accusative usually marks the patient of an action. So what you can do online in processing German and Japanese is using this information to make an initial assignment of a particular thematic role to the noun phrase, and then you just, wait for the verb to either sort of give you indication that your initial assignment was right or not. If not, then you really have to reprocess the whole sentence, and you can see in the brain that this causes a lot of additional sort of resources to do so. But certainly what we usually do, and in the interaction between the speaker and the hearer, we follow the Gricean principle, try to make yourself understandable. So we usually use unambiguous information to mark the particular thematic roles online so that the hearer can use this information. So yes, in principle, there might be a difference between English, who has the verb quite early, and languages where the verb comes very late, like German and Japanese, but those languages give you other types of information online that allow you to make the assignment of who is doing what to whom online. English doesn't allow so. It doesn't have any kind of case marking in the noun phrase. It's always the. However, we have case marking, for example, in English, in the pronouns. You have he versus him, for example. And this is the type of information that those other languages also have in their noun phrases. Chinese certainly gives you different types of information than, for example, English or German. Words, for example, are very often ambiguous, and the question is how can the system find an early possibility to disambiguate this information. So what you can show, for example, when you do event-related brain potential studies, is that a Chinese listener uses the information coming from the context to very early sort of disambiguate particular word meanings. That is already around 200 milliseconds after sort of the input of the particular word. When comparing, for example, the semantic effects in Japanese and English and German and Chinese, what you usually find is that the other languages where you don't have this ambiguity, differentiations can be done around 400 milliseconds. Usually the contextual information has an impact on the amplitude of the N400, not so much on the latency, how early or late the N400 is. But in Chinese, there is indication that this contextual information also has an impact on how early or late this particular negativity can be seen. Also, with respect to the syntactic processing, we have done a study in Chinese where we wanted to see whether syntactic information, which is not often marked overtly, has the same impact on initial phrase structure building as in German. And the interesting thing here again is that the Chinese speakers use, once it's overtly marked, they do use the syntactic information about word category very early. That is already about 50 milliseconds earlier than, for example, a German listener. So when we look across the languages, I think the real difference that we might be able to pinpoint down is rather in the temporal aspect of the processes. When is a certain information available and when is it used for the interpretation of the sentence, rather than saying there are totally different brain structures that do so. The brain structures rather seem to be very similar.